everyone, thank you for watching Elephant Fest and this event hosted by Nemira Publishing House. I'm very delighted to introduce to you Gabriela Garcia. Hello, welcome.
Delighted to be here.
Gabriela Garcia is the author of the novel Of Women and Salt, which we recently published at Nemira Publishing House, and we're so excited to have you here and to ask you some questions that all the readers will want to know after going through the book. So your book has just been launched this year, if I'm not mistaken, and it has taken aback both critics and readers alike. But I was wondering if it was a child of the lockdown and the pandemic, or did you start writing it before everything happened?
Oh yeah, long before everything happened. I started writing it like 5 years ago. So, it was launched during the pandemic here in the US, but yeah, I wrote it all years and years ago.
Okay, so it's a story that had been boiling and it's just now reached its audience, I guess. This is a very compelling story and a story about several generations of women. And it all starts in today's Miami when a young woman wants to find out more about her family and her roots, her Cuban roots. And you yourself are from a family of immigrants from Cuba and Mexico. So I was wondering if this story has anything to do with your heritage, or if not, I mean, how did you get to the idea to write about it?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I'm the daughter of immigrants. As you said, my mother's from Cuba, my father is from Mexico. And the novel is not autobiographical. My family is pretty different from the different families that I portray in the book and the different women that I portray in the book. But I was definitely influenced by similar to the protagonist of the book, Jeanette. I grew up in Miami. I'm also, daughter of immigrants as she is. And I grew up traveling a lot to to Cuba. I grew up traveling a lot to Mexico. I have a lot of family in both places. So, a lot of it was influenced by different parts of my life, definitely my travels to Cuba. I was also an organizer working in the migrant justice space. So I worked with women in detention. So there's a chapter that takes place in a detention center, an immigrant detention center here in Texas in the US. And so, I was definitely influenced by different parts of my life, even though the book is not, autobiographical per se.
So it has stories of several women, and it spans from 19th century cigar factories and the struggles of women at that time, and the struggle of displacement after getting to America and so on. So I was wondering if you did any kind of particular research, or you just heard stories and then you mixed them up and you came up with this, or did you do some particular research for it?
Yeah, in particular, as you mentioned, that chapter that takes place in the 19th century in Cuba, it required a lot of research. And actually, the chapter has, for example, letters from Victor Hugo, and it has newspaper articles from the time and different poems and stuff. And that's all pulled from real source material. And the inspiration for that chapter was actually a trip that I took to Cuba, where I went to this museum that had on display these letters from Victor Hugo to Cuban independence fighters and workers during that time. And I grew up around a lot of cigars. My family was very into cigars. And I always saw those names of those cigars, like Romeo y Julietas and Montecristos, but I never knew the history of it, which is that those are named after books that were really popular in the cigar factories. So, that museum exhibit and that, the history with the cigars just made me very interested in that sort of interplay between literature and class consciousness and, the revolutionaries at the time. I was just really fascinated by that history.
And where did you take the inspiration for your female characters, who are very compelling? So I was wondering if maybe they were, I don't know, a mix of someone you knew or a mix of somebody you read about or so on.
Yeah, so I knew I wanted to write a book that was only written in the voices of women. You know, like there are men and, you know, people who are not women in the book, but they're sort of at the periphery. It's all in the voices of women. And I think, you know, I think part of it is that I grew up in a very matriarchal family. You know, I was raised by a single mother, and, you know, she had all sisters. My grandmother had all sisters. My grandmother also helped raise me. I have all sisters. So I just grew up, you know, around women almost exclusively. And I never felt a lack in that, you know? And so I really wanted to write a book that sort of reflected my experience, you know, that it was just women, and it functions well that way, you know.
So the voices of women, the stories of women, how they felt, how they placed themselves in the world, and that really comes through in the book. There's also a phrase that always that appears a lot throughout the book, and it's sort of beautiful and like a perfect t-shirt phrase: we are force. Can you explain to us a bit the meaning of that, and then maybe which are the forces that, you know, influence the women in the book, that collide with the destinies of the women in the book?
Yeah, so that was a phrase that comes up in one of the letters from Victor Hugo specifically to women in Cuba. And I think ever since I read it, I was really struck by that phrase, we are force. And I love that it can, you know, take on different meanings. You know, force can be, you know, historical forces, which are very much at play in the novel, you know, the way that history is sort of in conversation with all of these characters. It can be, you know, force as in strength, and the way these women sort of support each other or don't, you know, or pass on strength. It can be sort of, you know, circumstances that are forced on these women, the way collectively, you know, women are forced. So there's so many different ways that that word can apply to what's happening in the novel. And so I was sort of really loved it and was struck by that. And I liked that I could sort of weave that into the book. You know, there's this book that's sort of passed on through generations, and that different women, that could mean different things to them. You know, everybody sort of took that phrase and interpreted it in their own ways and sort of saw it through their own lens, which I think is often the way that reading and literature works, right? You know, we bring our own experiences to it and create our own narratives. And so I liked that idea.
And your style also has a lot of force, but also a lot of poeticity. And after I read the book, actually, I read your biography and I saw that you actually wrote poetry. So I was wondering how it was to move from lyrics to such a well engraved story and a totally different frame of work to write a novel than to write poems or even a book of poetry.
Yeah, so I think my poetry is very much informed by my fiction writing, and I think my fiction is informed by poetry as well. And yeah, I think, you know, I think a lot about language, about rhythm, about, you know, musicality. And I think when I was writing the novel, I also sort of was thinking about placing all of these different chapters that are written in very different voices, very different tones, very different styles, you know, almost in the manner of like some poetry collections, you know? So I think it's definitely like influenced my work, and is very much in conversation with my poetry as well.
Are you working on anything else right now? Can you tell us?
So I am mostly working on shorter things. You know, I've been working on poems and short stories. I do want to work on, you know, a larger project, another novel, but it's not something I've started yet.
So Of Women and Salt was really well received, and I was wondering, this is usually a question you ask, you know, rock stars, but I'm going to ask you as well. Did you have any reaction that you enjoyed the most, not necessarily from someone famous, from another writer, let's say, maybe from someone who, you know, really found themselves in the experience of the women in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I've been so lucky and blessed, as you said, to have such wonderful reception from critics, and that's been really exciting. And definitely from writers I admire who've loved the book. But honestly, I think the best thing has been hearing from just regular readers, who will write to me, and everybody seems to like connect to one of the women, and people have really strong feelings about it. They're like, I loved Maria Isabel, or like, I really saw myself in Carmen. I really saw myself in, this person. And that's been really, really exciting to hear, the way that just everyday people really connect to these characters. It's really rewarding for me, that aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. So as you said, you have a lot of different voices in the book and a lot of different women. Which one was the hardest to write or to grasp correctly, let's say, from a writer point of view?
Yeah, I think they were all challenging in their own way, but I think the hardest thing is when I sort of wrote characters who did or said things that are maybe I wouldn't, or I would want differently, so like, for example, Carmen is deeply flawed, and this sort of brings some real like pain and hard moments in her life, and it was sort of hard to tap into that, knowing where this was all going to lead. It was hard to sort of tap into historical, the 19th century, and really think through how the world would look to somebody at that specific time. Yeah, I think all of it sort of had its own challenge, in that what I want for characters, or how I would want them to see the world, isn't necessarily what feels true to that character. And so that can be challenging.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned Carmen. I think it was the second one you mentioned, because she's sort of like, she's trying to block that knowledge of the past, which is exactly what this book does. Actually, it brings in the front some stories that are less known in the bigger history and the bigger picture. In the end, for the people who will watch this after they've read the book, I would like for you to tell them the main thing, the main idea, or the main feeling, or the main takeaway you'd like them to have after reading the book.
I think it's that that women are force, that women in the past and the battles that they've fought has certainly paved the way for my existence, for the possibilities in my life, and I'm shaped in so many ways by both the women in my own family, like in my own personal history, but also larger historical forces, and I think I hope that this book sort of honors that in some way.
Thank you so much. I can only honestly invite everybody to discover this wonderful novel and to take on this journey alongside with the wonderful woman in the book. And, just to remember that we are force, because that's a phrase I think it's a great takeaway from the book. Gabriela Garcia, the author of Women and Salt, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.